My name is Doug Greenberg from Rutgers University. We have what I think is a predictably small turnout on Sunday morning at the AHA, which in my experience is not the moment when the huge crowds show up, but we're going to make up for quantity, in quality what we may lack in quantity. I want to say a couple words about the session, and then we're going to really have a pretty open, wide-ranging discussion that I hope all of you will participate in as well. So let me first introduce the panelists. From my far left, Gretchen Soren is a nationally recognized leader in the museum field. I discovered that she is also a graduate of Douglas College of Rutgers University, which I didn't know, that Gretchen and I had that in common, and that we were almost exact contemporaries as students there. She's been in the museum profession for 35 years, worked with some 250 museums as a consultant, and has served as a curator for many, many exhibitions. The one that has special meaning for me is Bridges and Boundaries, African Americans and American Jews, which we put on at the Chicago Historical Society when I was the president there. And I have to say, for me, it was my favorite exhibition over 7 years in Chicago. Gretchen is now the director and the distinguished professor at the Cooperstown Graduate Program, which many of you know is if not the leading, among the leading graduate programs for history museums. To Gretchen's right, Rick Burns, well known to all of us for his remarkable documentary film, New York, a documentary film, as well as for a number of contributions to the American Experience series. And I must say I have a favorite one there too, and that's Rick's film on the Donner Party in 1992, which I always thought was not only a wonderful chapter for a documentary film to address, but also something that Rick did very creatively. He's also done documentary films that I think we would put in the category of the history of American art, a film about Ansel Adams, one about Eugene O'Neill, and Andy Warhol, and he is now working on a film about the American Ballet Theater. In addition, he has a film coming out, Death in the Civil War, which is based on a book many of us know, Drew Faust's book, The Republic of Suffering. The third member of the panel is a pinch hitter, and I'll say why in a moment. Jim Grossman is not only here at this panel, he's also our host as the executive director of the American Historical Association. Jim, before coming to the AHA and breathing new life into it, in my opinion, was the vice president for research and education at the Newberry Library. He taught at University of Chicago and University of California, San Diego. His most important and enduring, I think, scholarly work is Land of Hope, Chicago, Black Southerners, and the Great Migration. Jim's also been a consultant to a number of historical organizations and serves on a number of non-profit boards. Before I turn the conversation to our speakers, I do want to say that we lost two people who were originally scheduled to take part in this conversation. Mary Beth Norton broke her leg, as she put it, after 40 years of living in Ithaca, New York. She finally slipped and broke her leg, and therefore
taking out the recycling.
She said she was being, that's right, she said she was being a good citizen at the time. And there was a session in Mary Beth's honor the other day here. She came down for that, but her doctor really recommended that she not spend the weekend in New York, and so she had to go back to Ithaca and couldn't join us. And Jim is really filling in for Mary Beth. But some of you will remember from the program for the conference that originally my colleague and old and dear friend, Clem Price, was to be a member of this panel, and Clem died this fall suddenly, shockingly to those of us who have knew him for a long time, and that includes not only people at Rutgers, but really all over the country. And I mention that both because Clem deserves as much recognition as anybody can give him for his contributions to a range of areas in the humanities, including, by the way, the arts as well. Clem was the chair of the New Jersey Council on the Arts, as well as a member of the New Jersey Committee on the Humanities and the New Jersey Historical Commission over the years, and really, in some ways, embodied what I think of as the big idea that was behind both NEH and NEA. We miss both Mary Beth and Clem because they are Mary Beth and were Clem, but also because they had something special to offer to this panel. Clem was on President Obama's transition team and was particularly there to help advise about what happened next at NEH and NEA. And I don't think he was bound by confidentiality, and I think he would have had some interesting things to say. And Mary Beth, served on the council in the late 70s and early 80s, that is into the Reagan administration. And we know that she had some interesting things to say about the council. Unfortunately, she sent us a little message, and we'll try and get to some of the insights that Mary Beth had about the council and how the council operated over the course of the conversation. I also want to mention Malcolm Richardson from NEH, who helped put this session together and provided a lot of good guidance as we were thinking about what we might do. I thought I might just say at the beginning just a couple of words about the early history of NEH. And many of you may know this, but I thought just as a way of framing our conversation. First thing is that there's very little scholarship on the history of NEH. There's some of it good, a lot of it not really what I think we'd want. And it's a peculiar thing since historians at least tend to be quite self-reflective about their work, but we haven't been that reflective about NEH, which over the last 50 years has been really quite important to our discipline. And one thing that struck me as I was thinking about what we might talk about today is we don't have a really good long-term history of grant making at the NEH, and the way in which both the areas, and I mean the big areas of grant making at NEH have shifted over the years, and also the kinds of things, and I'm talking about data now rather than greatest hits, the kinds of things that NEH has spent most of its effort supporting. The other thing I want to note was the important role of private organizations in the creation of the NEH. The idea, by most accounts, was hatched at the American Council of Learned Societies by its then chair, Bob Lumiansky, who was a scholar of medieval literature. There had been a National Commission on the Humanities in the mid-50s. Bob and the Council of Graduate Schools and Phi Beta Kappa put together another National Commission on the Humanities. We have one that we've witnessed recently as well. And the idea was to think about what might be done to enhance public support for the humanities. The commission was chaired by the president of Brown University, Barnaby Keeney. And I think it's worth saying that it was done against the backdrop of a conversation in the culture that was worried about too much money being spent on science and engineering. This is in the aftermath of Sputnik, and people were concerned that the humanities and the arts were getting lost in the race to catch up with the Russians in science and engineering. What's interesting to me is that the scientists were among the most important advocates for the creation of NEH. They were in the conversation. They didn't say, well, we've got ours, you guys take care of yourselves. They were very much in the conversation. And just thought I'd read a quotation. This is from Glenn Seaborg, who was the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission. Quote, "We cannot afford to drift physically, morally, aesthetically in a world in which the current moves so rapidly, perhaps toward an abyss. Science and technology provide us with the means to travel swiftly, but what course shall we take? This is a question no computer can answer." And you can imagine that there are plenty of people in the humanities these days who might write those exact words, and we would consider them very timely. By the way, while NEH was being created, there was also a push for a National Arts Foundation, and the specific political ins and outs of that still need to be completely unraveled. But what eventually happened, LBJ, by the way, was all for a National Endowment for the Arts. He hesitated about a National Endowment for the Humanities. One of those who helped to persuade LBJ that a National Endowment for the Humanities might be a good idea, this I don't think will surprise you, was Bill Moyers, who was his press secretary and, of course, who is still an important voice in the humanities. Eventually what happened, and for very complicated political reasons, the Arts Foundation and the Arts Endowment and the Humanities Endowment were linked in the legislation into something called the National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities. The National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities still exists, by the way, although nobody, or I shouldn't say nobody, but very few people realize that since the Institute for Museum and Library Services has been added to the National Foundation, this link between the arts and humanities is one that I hope we'll talk about actually in this conversation, because it seems to me it's problematic in a very, very interesting way. In any case, we're at the 50th anniversary, or almost at the 50th anniversary. The bill creating the National Endowment for the Humanities was signed on September 29th, 1965. The budget for both endowments in the first year, this maybe will make us feel better, was $5 million for both endowments in the first year. And by the way, one of the first grants, and I've never quite thought, and I'm not sure I want to think about this too much, one of the first grants went to the American Council of Learned Societies. And the first chair of the National Endowment for Humanities was Barnaby Keeney, who had been chair of the National Commission created by the ACLS. As a former vice president of ACLS, of course, I wouldn't think to imply that there was anything strange about that. Okay, so let's turn to the panel. We have some questions that we want to talk about, and then depending on how the conversation goes and the time goes, we'll open it up to all of you. So I guess the first thing I want to ask, and ask each of you, maybe start with Gretchen, each person up here sort of represents a different piece of history, in some ways, of the humanities more generally. In your particular area of expertise, what difference has it made that for 50 years we've had a national federal agency that supported the humanities? And when I ask that, part of what I'm asking, of course, is what would have been different about, and this is the kind of speculation, counterfactual speculation that all historians love, what would have been different about the history of the humanities in the last 50 years if we hadn't had NEH? But let's start with what you think the accomplishments of NEH have been in your field. Gretchen?
I guess I'm the museum person here on the panel, so
Yep.
I'll talk about NEH and museum exhibitions primarily, which is my area of expertise. I have worked on a variety of very, very difficult exhibitions that deal with cultural intersection and interaction between groups. And there are relatively few organizations, funders, foundations that wanted to jump into some of the tough topics. I like to say people love to fund exhibitions on Chinese export porcelain. They're pretty. There's no controversy. Am I not loud enough? There's no controversy. Nobody's going to come and picket your exhibition. I don't like to do those exhibitions. I like to do the exhibitions that are tough, that really matter to people, and that will get people thinking about important issues in American society. And the NEH has always been willing to fund those exhibitions, and once the stamp of approval from the NEH went on an exhibition, everybody would jump on board. That's been my experience. So in that sense, the NEH has been a real catalyst for getting the fearful to engage with difficult subjects. And the exhibition that Doug mentioned, Bridges and Boundaries, African Americans and American Jews, was an exhibition at the Jewish Museum that we had a terrible time trying to fund, because it was an exhibition about the relationship between blacks and Jews in the North from the late 19th century. And it was, people were terrified, absolutely terrified of the topic. We got funding for both planning and implementation from NEH, and the money, after we got the NEH money, the money flooded in from other organizations. So in that sense, it was really a catalyst. The other thing I've noticed about NEH funding is that for organizations, especially in upstate New York where I live, organizations that have received NEH funding have been able to bring in scholars to do the kind of programming that they should do, rather than the kind of programming that they were traditionally able to afford. And so they've been able to really do some amazing exhibitions and programs for rural audiences. In New York City, there are plenty of avenues for fantastic programs, but in upstate New York, not so much. But with NEH funding, you can bring in scholars, you can actually get some serious history done. And I think for bringing those kinds of programs to rural audiences and audiences that would have no other access is very important. So those, I would say, are my two really good things.
Yeah, I think the catalyst piece is probably important in almost every area, right?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I think that the degree to which the endowment has acted as a catalyst is even more important, I think, now, and has been over the last 10 to 15 years, even than it was in the beginning, and it was crucial in the beginning. So speaking as somebody from the public television sector, which is its own very special, has its own niche within the kind of ecology of people in the humanities who are supported by the NEH. What Gretchen was saying about the degree to which the endowment's willingness to be there first with funding is really critical. And that has become, again, even more critical as time goes on, so that the other funding sources for public television, whether it's corporate or foundation or individuals, now more than ever are extremely reluctant to jump in until a project is well underway or is not. They're not going to risk money to do so. And so what has always been the case about the endowment's component, and certainly was the case on every film that I've had the opportunity to work with, going back to the 1980s, that critical role of coming in and providing funds so that work can begin, and therefore something is up on the board for other more reluctant, more skittish funders, both from the private and other public sectors, to come in, has been critical. But it's not just that role as the seed. I think it's also the process, which has been really, really key. And this is, everybody on the inside knows what the process is. Nobody on the outside knows what the process is. So that the impact on projects from the outset, because they go through the National Endowment's peer review proposal system, is really, really huge. So it's not just that the endowment has made possible public television in the humanities broadly, particularly in my field, in history, which is absolutely key in ways that are just demonstrable. It's also that the process itself has been one in which it's kind of customary for people to say, who would want to go through that process? But the fact is that anybody who's been through it not only, has fewer hairs on their head as a result of the fact, but they've also been forced to think through in a non-ideological way what their subject is, how it is seen and received, where the pitfalls and loose floorboards are, who the experts in the field are, what the current thinking is, what the traditional thinking is, and to come up with a proposal that reflects not only their excitement and their sense of its potential to reach a large audience, but the fact that they, the filmmakers, have immerse themselves sufficiently deeply in the project that they understand how to present it in a deep, which is to say, humanistic way. That, therefore, means that the projects, that has a ripple effect. Because if your projects are being peer reviewed and a significant sort of price of admission on the part of the reviewed proposal is that it show that kind of clarity of thinking and awareness of the broader context of the field the topic is associated with. That really simply continues to work through the life of the project. You do not throw away the proposal when you start making the film. The proposal is inevitably the kind of the Baedeker and Bible and guide to how to make it into something you go back to again and again. And so what I certainly know is anybody I know who's in public television who goes to the National Endowment for the Humanities knows that it's a gift that keeps on giving, and oddly, even if you don't get the funds. So that if you go through that process and get rejected, as has happened to me on numerous occasions, the work you've done to do that not only sort of explains to you why you got rejected, but also goes on helping the project as you go forward to make subsequent proposals to the NEH or think about the project. So there's that really, really critical. Now, I just think in a kind of a raw, the last thing I'll say is a raw kind of quantitative way. I don't think there would be history public television programming without the endowment. So just in a kind of just a simple, sort of banal, obvious way, the genetic link between history programming and the public and National Endowment is kind of crucial. I helped my brother work on his first proposal to a humanities institution for the Brooklyn Bridge in 1978. So the endowment at that point was 13 years old. Essentially every project my brother's been involved with has involved significant early support from the endowment, and also sometimes late support from the endowment, late in the project. And that was the case when he had hair down to his ass. So it wasn't as if, there's a kind of a funny thing where people go like, oh, it's only certain kinds of people who get, money from the endowment. Well, I can tell you that the endowment may be, I don't think the endowment has ever been indulgent to the people who've already gotten funds. Each time it's basically the same criteria. It's basically the endowment's attitude is, what have you done for me lately? With respect to the quality and the thoroughness with which you've prepared your proposal. So it may be helpful if you've had a track record, but it doesn't seem to be necessary, which is another role the endowment has, which is that new-timers, first-comers, can actually get a very plausible hearing. I'm currently working on two projects, one on the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act, initial funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Another film about the Pilgrims, extremely important early funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And unlike, Gretchen, what you were saying in the kind of the museum world and the curatorial world, in some sense, I don't think it's the projects which are difficult and therefore not going to be funded necessarily, which in public television make the endowment so crucial. It's that the work itself is so difficult. I could sit down and watch a history program on television, and I can tell you within 2 or 3 minutes whether it's public television or not, and whether it's been supported or not by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it's simply that the National Endowment for the Humanities is actually funding budgets which are probably larger at the end of the day, irrespective of their whole contribution, because surprise, surprise, nobody's Mozart, nobody's a genius. You do it, put your pants on one leg at a time, and what you're getting with the support of the endowment is more time to think through the cliches, the redundancies, the sort of received ideas, and try to get to something which is deep, is resonant, whether or not it's controversial or not, is almost irrespective of the case. And so that it's that quality of having a resource, a funding resource, which is there to do nothing more or less than to help you not screw it up at a kind of an intellectual level. That's, you know, I've probably been involved with 50 hours of public television program. Can 100, you know, 3/4 of the projects are supported by that, and each time out have benefited from it. So, you know, many of my program officers are in the audience today. So, but I want them to know I would say this even if they weren't here.
I think let's come back to talk a little bit more about the process later on. But maybe Jim, you could talk a little bit. Jim is sort of the not only a pinch hitter but a utility infielder on the panel, because he's played a lot of positions in the world of history and the humanities. So
Yeah, the process will be important, I think. But I'd like to pick up then on things that Rick and Gretchen have just talked about a little bit, and emphasize a few terms here: risk, leverage, stamp of approval. But even before that, what I'd like to, when Doug first said the impact, the larger impact of the NEH, I think there's a certain amount of democratization that the NEH has created, in the sense that it has enabled people who are not at Harvard to have opportunities. A lot of my experience with the NEH has been through the fellowships program and through the Division of Education programs. I mean, I've actually been fortunate enough to get money from every part of the NEH at some point in my life, except for the state partnership. So I have a pretty good sense of how the different parts work. And what's striking about all parts of the NEH is this level, is this impact on the democratization of humanities funding in the United States. That before the NEH, the disparity in the ability of faculty members to get time off and resources to do research, to travel to do research, was, I mean, you had such a difference between the places that had lots of money and the places that had no money. And one of the things that the NEH has done is to expand those opportunities, not just through the fellowships program, but through its summer institutes program, its summer seminars program. The summer seminar that I taught with NEH money was filled with people who taught at places that I had never heard of, and I watched a lot of college basketball, and I applied for a lot of jobs once upon a time. So and what's interesting about this democratization process is that you hear the flip side of it when you get involved with projects, and from my perspective, it's been both films and museums as an advisor, where they're not going to the NEH. And I say, gee, why didn't you go to the NEH? And they'll say, oh, it's not worth jumping through those hoops. And the people who are usually saying it's not worth jumping through the hoops are the people who can get money anyway. The people who can't get money otherwise have no problem jumping through the hoops. And that means that the hoops are good, because what it means is that it doesn't matter who you are. You could be Rick Burns and Gretchen Soren, but you have to jump through the same hoops as the guy standing out there in the hallway who wants to make a new film. Everybody's got to follow the same rules. You can't call a board member and say, can you facilitate this grant? You can't have your father go to his pals at the country club and get money from a foundation. You've got to go through the same process. And I think that this has been a huge influence in terms of the ability of different people working in different institutions to get funding for things. We haven't talked at all about the state councils, and Doug would, okay, so I'll leave that off because Doug can do that in terms of impact. I think this issue of risk, the NEH has been willing, in fact, to fund things that maybe at first other people wouldn't look at. And again, this is in part because every proposal does get reviewed on its merits. I think this issue of leverage and stamp of approval is very important. I mean, I can remember one grant that I had from the NEH where it was a matching grant. I needed to raise about another $600,000, $700,000, and to walk into foundation offices and say, well, the National Endowment for the Humanities has given us a matching grant of $600,000, and for every dollar you give us, we'll get another dollar from the NIH. First of all, it does mean they're leveraging their money, which people in the private sector especially like to hear. But the second thing is, especially in corporate foundations, as opposed to some of the big national foundations, especially in corporate foundations, they have no idea what peer review is. And so if you say, well, it was peer reviewed by the NIH, they don't know what that means. So you have to explain it. And this is actually one reason why, in fact, everybody who tries to raise money using the NEH peer review system as leverage ought to serve on a peer review panel themselves. Because the ability to then say, well, here's how my project got funded. Here's what it had to go through. And then you explain it. And they look at you and they go, you've got to be kidding me. We don't put people through that. And so this ability to leverage the NEH funding I have found to be tremendously valuable. So I would put it in those kinds of areas, which all in some ways come down to a certain amount of democratization.
Well, that's a great start to our conversation. I'm going to add a little bit to this. I should have mentioned at the beginning that originally I was going to be an impassive, non-participating chair, but as our numbers dwindled, I decided maybe I could talk a little bit, and maybe I'll speak as a former hoop jumper, to use Jim's metaphor. Jim said that he had gotten at some point grants from almost every division of NEH. What I was going to say is even more personal than that. I think in every job I've ever had, and I've been more than a little peripatetic, I've had some grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I want to say something about the first one, because it's a program that doesn't exist anymore, but it speaks to Jim's question. The first time I had support from NEH, I was an assistant professor at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, a very good, very small, very isolated liberal arts college. And I was just beginning my career, and I didn't have anybody to talk to about my scholarship. And NEH in those days had not just summer seminars, it had a year-long seminar program for teachers from liberal arts colleges. And you applied to the seminar. It was run by some very senior person at a major institution. And then there were 10 or 11 other assistant professors who would join the seminar. And it was on a big topic that was connected to your research, but something where everybody had something in common. The specifics of that seminar are not nearly as important to me as to say it sort of kept me alive in a very isolated situation intellectually, to be able to sit in a seminar room. In my case, it was at Princeton, but they were run at universities all over the country with people who were similarly circumstanced to me, but both in the sense that they were working in fairly isolated circumstances, but also in the sense that they had scholarly projects about which they had nobody to talk with. And that was a great leveraging in a different way for individual scholars, and some of the seminars obviously took on some of that role as well. I did want to say another thing about the hoop jumping, and it's been a while since I've actually done an application myself, but my memory of doing NEH applications was I always thought that if you could figure out how to fill out the application successfully, they should give you the grant just for having succeeded in filling out the application forms. I'm sure it's much simpler now than it used to be. But as I think back, I have colleagues. But as I think about this question of leveraging, I think it's not only about institutional leveraging, which in a way is what we're talking about, although films are in some ways personal, and curating an exhibit is personal, but there's a collective group of people who are being supported, but it's also important for individual scholars. And we may come to the fellowship program at some point, because I think there's some interesting things that have happened over the years in the fellowship program. But I do think that NEH stamp of approval is a very powerful thing. And I think it's obvious from what we've said here that we can all point to not only to successes with which we have been individually involved, but larger successes for the discipline and indeed for the humanities at large. But I want to flip the conversation for a second and ask you if you'd like to say something about what NEH has failed to do, or maybe a better way to say it, what have been the failures of not so much of the agency, but of the idea of the National Endowment for the Humanities. If any, you may not think that there are, but I think it's probably a good thing for us not just to talk about successes, but failures as well.
I would say two things. One would be, I think the NEH has not succeeded in establishing a national constituency for the humanities. That doesn't mean that one could have expected the NEH to do it. I guess I would say one could have hoped that the NEH might be able to do it. And I think about it in the context in many ways of what Rick and Ken Burns do, which is that I think most people don't realize when they're watching what you guys do that that's the humanities. Right. And so it's, oh wow, that was fabulous. But then if an hour later I say, don't you think we should be funding work in the humanities? They would say, no, of course not. It's a waste. That's a waste. Why do that? So, and I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure what could be done here. But somehow that's the first thing that I think has not been accomplished. The second thing is I think that the NEH took too long to bring together academic and public constituencies. One of the things that the NEH was a pioneer in was public humanities, especially at first through the state councils, but also the Division of Public Programs funding projects like the two people to my left have been working on all their lives. But I think, and I think one of the things the NEH did accomplish, by the way, was bringing together academics and public humanities programs by requiring academic advisory boards for public humanities projects. But that's in some ways at the backroom level. I don't think that, I think it's taken too long for us to be thinking about how academics and people working in public humanities could be working more closely together. So these are the two places where I find sort of levels of frustration. Again, not because I can come up with the way the NEH could have done this, but it just hasn't been accomplished.
I think that the reason it seems to me why, Jim, the endowment has failed to achieve that kind of national recognition, sort of broaden the identity and reality of the humanities, speaks to me not so much a failure on the endowment's part, but a reality of American culture and society, which makes the sort of situation in which the endowment exists intrinsically paradoxical. That I think there's a profound, I think it's sort of it's a banality but true one to say that American culture has had historically a profound uneasiness about history, the humanities, and culture. And that my sense of the sort of the vicissitudes of the endowment over the last 50 years to the degree to which that it's sometimes not succeeded in ways it might have liked to, or I might have wished that it were succeeding, has to do a lot with the way in which there's kind of an uneasiness which is deeply rooted about what the humanities might be and what culture is in America. And so what you find is that what I've found is that oftentimes, as you're saying, projects which were funded and lauded by the humanities doesn't in any way, the fact that doesn't in any way then shed, as it, in my view, it should, positive light on the NEH, I think is a result of this, should the state be involved in the business of supporting culture? And the question tends to be a kind of a resounding but quiet yes, looked at demographically, and a resounding and vociferous no, looked at with respect to particularly forces, in my view, on the right, when it comes to questions of culture. So what you end up seeing is that the endowment has turned out, in my view, again, as someone outside it, but who is a patron of it, or rather a client of it, someone who's benefited from it. The endowment has tended to seem to be rigging its own cultural rules from inside. At those moments where there tends to be some usually conservative force abroad in the culture who feels that the state is involved in funding an agency which is being insufficiently patriotic or insufficiently American by some definition. And so you get a circumstance in which the endowment sometimes steps into be self-correcting and correcting of what it perceives to be the natural market forces in the cultural world, which, left unimpacted by the state, turn out to do something which I don't think is either right or left, but by that very, in that very way, turns out to run athwart of certain kinds of conservative cultural values. So that the very idea that it might be that liberal both exists in a capital L as a political reality, but also with a small l as something which means sort of broadly contextual, seeing multiple points of views. There are points in which that has become, in the endowment's history, something which is seen by some people who have been at the endowment as being, and some people who have criticized the endowment, as being a politically vulnerable and inimical thing, and so they've stepped in to sort of correct the direction of the endowment from the side. So I think that, on the one hand, the successes of the endowment, which have been exactly in this area of democratization and leveraging, its failures have been that it has never been able to achieve a kind of a critical mass, and my view after 30 or 40 years is that it will never achieve that critical mass. And no amount of tinkering with the endowment from within could ever change it, because we're talking about something profound, and I don't want to say hardwired because that makes it sound immutable, but profoundly to do with American culture and society, which the endowment is in some sense helpless to change, although it is not helpless to reflect upon, and shed light upon.
Gotcha. Oh, can I add anything?
Yesterday when I was driving down from Cooperstown, I was listening to NPR, and I was listening to a very well-reasoned, really interesting article about a woman, an academic, talking about food security. And as I was listening to it, it dawned on me that it was incredibly well-reasoned, incredibly academic. She was using words, I thought, oh, I wonder what that word means. And it dawned on me she could never possibly make her case because it was such an academic argument. And I think that sometimes those of us who work in the humanities, we call it the public humanities or the digital humanities, I don't think the public has a clue what that even means. And for museums and exhibitions, I think we often, we decide what the topics are. And if you really, the direction that museums have been moving in, I'm not sure if my argument is even coherent at this point, but the direction that museums have been moving in is actually, if you want people to come to your museum, you want to ask them, what are they interested in? What areas of history would they like to know about? What matters in their lives, not what matters to us as academics, and what would we like to do exhibitions about? What would we like to do programs about? I think where we failed is to really engage with the public on issues that matter to them and engaging them in issues that matter to them. Asking. We don't ask. The NEH and all of what we do primarily is a very top-down process, not a bottom-up process. And I think that is, I think we've got to go more to a bottom-up process. I know this is a science example, but the New York State Museum was working on an exhibition about snakes, and they brought the scientists in, they asked the scientists what they wanted the exhibition to be about, and the scientists were talking about the digestive system of the snake and how that works. And they asked the public, well, what do you want to know about snakes? And they said, Are they slimy? How do they feel? Can we touch them? And do you want to know about the digestive system of the snake? Well, no. Can it swallow a rat whole? That's what I want to know, but I don't care about the digestive system. So the things that we care about may not necessarily be the same things that the public cares about. And if we want humanities programming to be embraced more broadly by the general public, I think we have to care about what the public is interested in and find out. I think we have to ask, and I don't think we do that very well.
I think that's a great point. I want to respond to something Rick said and then to what Gretchen said. I think this idea that there's a paradox in American culture about such things is a really important point, and I think it's actually institutionally built in to NEH. We have a politically appointed chair of NEH who is in charge of support for culture. And I have to say that I think at the beginning, the first couple of chairs did a pretty good job they were not only themselves experts in the humanities, but they tried to keep it separate from the politics of their time. And I think that's one of the things that in the very early years gave NEH such credibility, was that it was not perceived at first to be a politicized agency. But I think the paradox eventually reared its ugly head. And I think we can all remember, or many of us can remember when that was. But it was not, I want to emphasize, at the beginning of the Reagan administration. From the point of view of appropriations, the endowments never did better than they did in the first couple of years of the Reagan administration, and that's something that is sometimes lost. Later on, it got to be, how shall I say, unpleasant when we discovered that the chair of NEH actually had access to nuclear weapons because she was married to the Secretary of Defense. And I guess I want to say, I wasn't sure I was going to bring this up, but I'm going to, that when Bill Bennett and Lynn Cheney were the chairs of NEH, apart from the arguments that many of us were having about the endowment and with them about what the endowment should do and what the content should be, I think that one of the long-lasting, and this gets to failures, one of the long-lasting consequences of those two chairs of the endowment was to undermine the legitimacy of the grant-making process. Now, that's not to say that the grant-making process was corrupt, but there was a perception in the community that I think some of us remember very well, that there was no point in going to NEH, not because there were so many hoops to go through, but because certain kinds of things would not be supported by NEH. For the most part, as I used to try to tell people, that was not the case. But a certain kind of self-selection in the applicant pool began to happen, I think, in the late 80s and early 90s. That was extremely unfortunate because I know, and there's staff members here, but we all knew that the staff was still doing its job, the peer review system was still working, but you couldn't make decisions about applications that you didn't receive. And I knew many, many people who did not submit applications to NEH in those years because they believed that the politics of the agency were so powerful. That's not exactly a failure of the agency, but it's something that if we were to write the history of NEH, I think we'd want to understand better than at least I do. And then the other point I wanted to make was about Gretchen's point about we need to listen more to the public. I think that's right. I think actually the museum world has tried very hard to listen more to the public, sometimes for reasons that would be peculiar to most scholars. That is, museums have to get people through the door. And if you're not going to get them through the door with the digestive system of snakes, then you figure out another way to get them through the door, and that is, are snakes slimy? Which is a marketing decision to some degree. And there's a balance, another balance, I think, that always has to be struck, and I'm sure Rick's experienced this as well, between what you know will attract an audience and what, from a historian's point of view, represents good history with high integrity. And I think, obviously, that those things can be kept in balance. But I think in the museum world, and I think filmmakers too, do a better job at it than those of us who have landed one way or another in universities, where we certainly all have colleagues who have contempt for the public. And that contempt is returned in equal measure, sometimes toward the humanities generally. The state councils represent, in my view, an interesting attempt to deal with Jim's question about how do you broaden out the audience, how do you pull people in, and let me just say a word about that, and then I'll shut up. For my sins, I've been a member of 2 state councils and the chair of another, and I'm a member of the council now. And I have to say that Gretchen's question is a question that, in my experience, is asked around the board table in state humanities councils. How do we serve the people of our state? Now, sometimes that leads state councils to say, well, the only thing we ought to do is the history of New Jersey, which, of course, is a deeply fascinating subject, but it isn't the humanities. And that conversation happens. There is a concern, and in some ways it's amped up in recent years, to bring people in a particular state into the conversation, both about what the humanities are, but also about what the humanities should be doing and what kinds of questions the humanities ought to address. I think state councils probably fail at that conversation as often as they succeed, but it's the right conversation, as Gretchen points out, for us to have. But it then comes back to another question about the early origins of NEH. The state councils are not in the original legislation. And there was no money for the state councils in the original legislation. The original legislation was written by scholars, some of them scholars at the highest level of what should I say, public indigestibility. And I don't mean that as a criticism, but as this is the way that scholarship at the highest level is done, and the people responsible were people who did that kind of scholarship. They thought of NEH as an agency that would support the best work of the best scholars, full stop. And the state councils only come along a bit later. And I think that was a good thing. And the same thing for public humanities. So the problem of having this conversation about what is being done by scholars in universities and in research institutions, as opposed to what we now call the public humanities, I think has amped up actually over the years. It wasn't actually really important at the very beginning, and it has become more important as time has gone on, and maybe there's a sort of perverse inverse law here, as public support for the humanities seems to have gone down. Or at least concerns about funding for NEH have gone up, this conversation has become more important among people who actually are professional humanists and historians, because they realize that this question has to be addressed. So I think that the paradox that Rick pointed to is there. I think it's built into the endowment, and I think also this question of how the public and the humanities interact is also very important. I want to just flip back quickly, although some of the three of you might want to say something about state councils, to the relationship between the humanities and the arts, and the perception at the beginning of the endowment, that the arts and humanities belonged in the same piece of legislation. And I wonder what your thinking is about how that works, and maybe historically what that's meant for the agency, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing for the arts and the humanities to be so closely linked together, not only in the agency, but in people's perception of federal activity with respect to culture.
You know, having never received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, it's difficult for me to sort of speak about that from the inside. I do think my sort of anecdotal sense is that the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, has suffered from some analogous version of the paradox that we're talking about, but maybe even more extremely. Art is at least something which is a three-letter word and known to the public. Humanities is, you know, a four-syllable word, completely unknown to the general public. That's been the virtue in a certain way of the humanities, because it's kind of flying beneath a radar, a little more outside a kind of a culture war than art, which very quickly finds its way into cultural wars. And so I think to some degree, the humanities and its endowment at the national level have found a way through, sometimes my impression from the outside has been through sort of very carefully being very quiet and standing still, to just go, not in any way want to say we're not part of, you know, crucifixes plunged in urine, but could we really talk about something else for a second? And that sort of like, could we talk about something else for a second is sort of to say, we're completely aware that these very, very hot button cultural issues in the arts, especially at the radical end of the arts, are very contentious and are of course going to set in motion very, very powerful feelings in the body politic and in American culture. But we here at the Endowment for the Humanities are grateful that nobody knows how to spell it or what it really means, but kind of, you know, everybody knows what a crucifix in urine looks like. I mean, they can kind of picture it in their own mind, and they can decide that sure as heck is art or that sure as hell isn't art. And so there's been a kind of a funny, just sort of, not even sibling, but kind of clan relationship between the two endowments, which I think, you know, has been there from the start.
I'm going to use that word, digestible. I'm really liking that. I wrote down your quote, scholarship at the highest level of public indigestibility. Really like that, Doug. I've been on several NEH panels where this has actually been debated. An art history exhibition will come up. I'm always on the exhibition panels. And somebody will say, well, I don't think we should fund that because it's art history, and somebody else will say, well, art history is one of the humanities, so yes, we should fund it. And then the debate goes back and forth. Well, they have their own agency. Let them go to the Arts Endowment. And what I've enjoyed, I think, about some of the exhibitions that the endowment funds, the Endowment for the Humanities funds, is the interdisciplinarity of them. I think it enriches public understanding, and as you can tell, I'm the advocate for the public in all the programs that the Humanities Council does. I think the interdisciplinarity really enriches what we do, and I like the fact that history and art history and other fields can be brought into these exhibitions and into these programs, and I think it broadens the audience and makes them better. So that's my thought.
Woody Allen once famously said that when the lion lies down with the lamb doesn't get much sleep. And I feel the same way about the arts and the humanities. When the humanities lie down with the arts, the humanities don't get much attention. I've been to conferences on cultural policy, public policy toward the arts and the humanities, and what happens at these conferences is 90% of the conversation is about the arts. And I'm fascinated by this, that every time we bring the arts and the humanities into the same room, even if it's a room filled with humanists, it ends up being about arts policy and about the arts.
Because people know what the arts are.
I think that's exactly right.
It's dance, it's music, I mean, you
Yeah.
can define it.
And you can
What's
see
the
it.
humanities?
Right, and you can see it. You can also, I think, as Rick is saying, you can also say, and I don't think that's art. And it's much harder for people to. People can say, I don't think that's literature, but they have a real hard problem saying, I don't think that's literary criticism. So I think for much of the humanities, people really don't know or don't feel confident that they know what it is. And what that means is that for the period that Rick was talking about, the one might call the Mapplethorpe era, the NEH did quite well because it was flying under the radar. But I think at other times it's meant that it becomes more difficult to fund humanities projects because people simply don't get it. And I think it goes back to what Gretchen was talking about, which is the public, that it's often much harder to convince a non-NEH funder that the public wants this. I can convince a funder that the public wants to know whether a snake is slimy. But it could be much harder for me to convince a non-NEH funder that the public wants to look at an exhibit about America in 1492, which Columbus isn't in.
You know, but I think that that problem is something which the NEH, the Endowment for the Humanities, comes by not just honestly, but inevitably, because it's, broadly speaking, you could think of its role as being, on the one hand, and this is not quite right, but on the one hand, helping support, let's call it, legitimate primary research in the humanities, the work of scholars. On the other hand, it's supporting or helping to support public programming in museums or public television, which is almost never about primary scholarship, sort of pushing out the boundaries of the field. So the former is powerfully recondite and having to do with the digestive systems of snakes. The latter is, should it or shouldn't it be recondite? Well, it should be, but it needs to be digestible by that great snake, which is the public. So between those two things...
Between snakes and digestibility, this conversation is going in directions that none of us expected, I suspect.
But so what I know, in my experience, is that the endowment has acted as, not only does it act by supporting scholars, which is really not our work, but our work is using the work of those scholars. So that, every project, I could explain in detail how it was that the project was helped not only by its funding by the endowment, not only by the process, but by the scholars and the scholarly work that we were brought into contact with as a result of that. So that Ira Berlin, Barbara Fields, associated with the Freedom Project and this extraordinary documentary history of emancipation from the bottom up, so to speak, was brought to our attention and actually forcefully brought within the precincts of our project by scholars in the field, specifically Ira Berliner, specifically Barbara Fields, who would, in their often scathing criticisms of our treatments, go, well, there's a slave from Glasgow, Missouri named Spotswood Rice who escaped from her plantation and wrote this letter, you may be interested in it, and Barbara Fields wrote out the text with citation in the manuscript. So that found its way literally wholesale into the film. It would not have been available to the scholars without the kinds of research that was being done that's supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and nor would it be made available to the public if we weren't, A, there to make a film about it, and B, there to make a film about it under circumstances in which it was required of us that we avail that knowledge. So that's why I say nobody knows what the process is for the humanities. It's not just they don't know what the humanities is, they don't know what the process is, because it is a long, arduous, multifactorial process in which, it's hard, somebody's got to do it, they're doing it, and I think its success rate at acting as the instigator for scholarship and the instigator for public history on the one hand, and facilitating the relationship between the two
That's
is
all.
really, really been key. And that's why, it's never going to solve the cultural problems of America, but what it is going to do is help scholarship move forward and help the public presentation of the humanities step forward by insisting that there be a dialogue between those two facts.
That's all fine and good for us. I think one of the problems is the four of us are historians, the people in the audience are historians. I don't know how well that works for our colleagues in literary studies, philosophy, some of the humanities disciplines that are less digestible. And so it's just one thing I want to throw out there, that we're speaking very much as historians who are in the most digestible discipline. So,
Well, we're also in a discipline about which many people already have opinions and think they know something, and I think that's important. But as long as you mention it, one of the things I think we know from at least applications I've seen in private venues is historians tend to do much better with applications. I don't know if this is true at NEH, but it's certainly been true in a number of different places where I've been involved in making decisions about funding. Historians tend to do better than people in literary studies and philosophy because we have at least some impulse that we're actually talking about something that matters to people. And I hate to put it this way, we're not quite so precious about our knowledge. But I want to go back to just a couple of things. One is this business of what the humanities are. My sense of this has always been the humanities are like pornography. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know it when I see it. As a Supreme Court justice famously said, it turned out he was watching it in the basement of the Supreme Court building, which is how he knew it when he saw it. So I think, just to go back to the state councils, on all three of the state councils on which I have served, we always tried to get members of those boards who were not professional humanists, but people who cared about the humanities. But inevitably, and I've been witness to too many of these conversations, the conversation about what the humanities are is a conversation that happens around the boards of state humanities councils, because people think they know, and this conversation about the humanities and the arts gets, at least in the three that I've been on, gets replicated over and over again. And I think Rick's point, though, about scholarship, building the resources that make it possible for excellent historical documentary films to be made, for great museum exhibitions to be made, is a really important point. But it's not a point, and this is not on the agency, this is on all of us. I don't think we've made that point very well politically in trying to garner support for NEH. After all, it's not up to the staff of NEH to figure out how to get the public to support more money for NEH. The rest of us have not built the links that I think we really ought to have built, which we all know from our own work, between scholarship that itself might be indigestible for the general public, but in a way, that's what documentary films and museums are doing it. They're digesting it so that it can be understood. That's a bad metaphor, I just realized, but really bad metaphor. But I'm sorry I started it. But I do think that's a political problem, to make the case that there's a relationship between scholarship at the highest level and a great historical documentary film. And I don't think we've done the job that we should have done. On the other hand, I do want to say, and maybe this is just a function of my having been around this for too long, is there really are people on the other side of the conversation. I'm not talking about the other side of the conversation inside the endowment, but the political conversation. There really are people who hate us. And they hate us, and I disagree with Jim a little bit. When the arts were taking it, we were getting tarred with that brush. Now, it happened to be at the same time that that post-structuralism was taking over scholarship, and so we were an easy target. But it wasn't just NEA that was catching it in those years. And I just tell you one story that some of you may know. Jamil Zainuddin was the chair of the Federation of State Humanities Councils in that period. He's now the chair of the executive director of the Georgia Council. And every year, the State Humanities Councils go around to Congress, and they meet and try to persuade Congress people that it would be a great thing to support the humanities. And Jamil tells a story. He went to see a congressman whose first name I now forget, but whose last name I remember well, named Livingston, from Louisiana, to talk to him about the humanities, not about the arts. And Jamil gave him his speech, and those of you who know Jamil know he's an extremely charming person. Nobody would regard him as an ideologue. And this guy, Livingston, reached into his desk and pulled out a Bowie knife. And he said, "You see this Bowie knife? This is the knife I'm going to use to kill the National Endowment for the Humanities." Now, we can say, well, Livingston is long gone. He's probably been in jail or something. But I think we shouldn't underestimate there is contempt out there, not just lack of understanding, but contempt based on a lack of understanding. And I think in some ways this has been our failure as a community. We have not succeeded. Never mind, we haven't asked the public what they think they would like. We haven't tried to talk to the public about the values that we represent. And ironically, I can't help but do this. The initial founding legislation of NEH has some pretty good arguments. So let me just read you a couple of the first pieces of the legislation, and then I'll turn it back to everybody else. 1, the arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States. 2, the encouragement and support of national progress and scholarship in the humanities and the arts, while primarily a matter for private and local initiative, are also appropriate matters of concern for the federal government. An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other great branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future. This is really very eloquent. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. And it goes on. I won't read the rest. But there is a vision there. And so when I asked about failure, I guess that's what I was thinking, is that it's our failure, not the agency's failure.
But we say we're doing history exhibitions, history films. We don't say we're doing humanities films or humanities exhibitions. So we're confusing the public.
Yeah.
Or art, we're doing art. This is an art exhibition. This is not, we don't say this is a humanities exhibition.
I agree. In a way, that's what I'm saying. Is that
Well,
we
I-
haven't figured out the right way to make the case.
I don't think there's any kind of emotional disagreement, possibly even in this room, certainly not on this panel. I do think, though, that I'm not quite sure how that argument would be made. And that's not to sort of throw up my hands and sort of say, like, let's fold our cards. Because I think that in a culture that has such expressed such, mobilized is a better way to put it maybe, such enormous anxiety about anything that's not a market-driven value, force, or product. It's very, very difficult to make the case for an agency which is essentially saying these will not be market-driven values, forces, or products. They may well then have a life out in a marketplace. They certainly will, and we hope they do. And they will then become part of a larger market-driven scrimmage. But that the point of that language is to say that marketplace is going to be impoverished if we don't find certain ways to fund activities which will not succeed if they're only allowed to be only supported by the market. my sense at 59 of what the situation of American culture is that I do not understand whether or not it would abet or hurt the humanities if I were to sit about trying to make the argument publicly for the importance of non-market driven values, products, and forces, unless I was making a religious argument. I've tried to make the argument in this city all the time and say, imagine the humanities, public TV is a little bit like a park that doesn't exist as a theme park for commercial purposes, but exists like Central Park right up the street. Which is to say, in the most commercial, market-driven city in the world, here's 840 acres set aside permanently for non-commercial reasons. The odd thing is that although, of course, there were incredible arguments in the 1840s and 1850s with Bowie knives about whether or not 840 acres should be set apart north of town of what would very quickly become the Central Park in the middle of town. But nobody now retroactively disputes the idea that having those 840 non-commercial acres is a good thing and, in fact, abets market values. Look at the cost of a co-op on Fifth Avenue or Central Park West. So that's kind of the business we're involved in, is trying to create prospectively central parks of the mind, which will eventually exist in the larger context of a culture, which will value them from within and from without the context of market forces. How you make that argument successfully in the context of American culture, I think is just an ongoing problem, because when I've made this very argument, people have said to me, are you crazy? Karl Rove would never allow Central Park in a million years. So I think that that's the reality, and I'm not quite sure if then sort of what I described as the kind of the almost sort of stylized quietude of the National Endowment for the Humanities staff, stand dressed nicely, stand quietly and politely, hope you don't get hit by a snowball, and go about your work. May actually be, in the context of American culture, the best way to abet those, because the minute you bring up the argument, you make yourself a very, very wide target. I mean,
I want to make Karl Rove's argument. I was reading a museum case study this week for the Mississippi River Museum. And the Mississippi River Museum, which is in Dubuque, was a tiny historic house. It was with a budget of $13,000. I was actually quite shocked by the size of this. This institution starts out $13,000 budget for the year. Little historic house, very boring, not terribly interesting. The director, Jerome Ensler, turns with NEH support. And what struck me as I was reading the case study was NEH kept appearing. It would be NEH Planning Grant, NEH Challenge Grant, NEH, throughout the case study, at every step along the way, as the institution developed, there was an NEH grant, planning, implementation, challenge along the way. Jerry Ensler, with the mayor's help and the NEH support, turned this $13,000 a year historic house into a multi-million-dollar center for the study of the Mississippi River in Dubuque. Why would the Center for the Study of the Mississippi be in Dubuque? It wouldn't. But he created this with the support of NEH. He used NEH to turn his museum into an economic engine for Dubuque. Now that, to me, says that the NEH is involved in economic development. That's the Karl Rove argument, I think. That's how we can make an argument that the humanities it's not just Central Park, but it's also, it's an engine that drives the economy.
Right.
So,
but that works for public humanities. There is I think one of the wonderful things Yeah, exactly, and it doesn't work for the Division of Research at the NEH, which has made a tremendous contribution. Again, I'll go back to the democratization of research funds, and it doesn't even work necessarily. The Division of Education, it might work a little bit there for some of its programs, but it's not until you recognize what I think most people in this room would consider the obvious, which is that education is public investment. But there are people who have trouble with that concept of education as a public good. I think maybe that gets me to what I hadn't thought about as when you asked what, I don't want to say failures. I would prefer to say what things has the NEH not been able to accomplish. I think that's a, and I think there's a difference. Absolutely. And maybe this goes back to the divisions. One of the great strengths of the NEH is that all of the things that Rick and Gretchen have been talking about could be accomplished by the Division of Public Programs because of the ways in which those divisions operated at a variety of levels, and while at the same time the Division of Research was funding the things that are not as accessible to a general public. But maybe one of the problems is the silos. I've more than once had a conversation with an NEH program officer in one division which will say, well, you can't, no, we really can't talk about that. You've got to go over to education to talk about that. We don't do that here. And so I think that things that fall in neither or both, which may well be in some ways the most important ways in which the NEH could bridge some of these gaps, end up becoming impossible because of the siloed nature of the divisions. So maybe that's a part of the problem. I think some of what we're talking about here also is what I would call, not inevitable necessarily, but almost timeless conflict between, I hate to say it, meritocracy and democracy. That when we say, what is the best work that's being done in the discipline of philosophy right now? That may well be work that is not accessible to the general public. And it's the same thing in physics. It's the same thing in mathematics. It's not limited to the humanities. The most advanced scholarship is often something that the rest of us can't figure out whatsoever. So I think that tension will always exist, and maybe that's why breaking down some of the distinctions between the divisions might actually help us with that.
So I want to open the floor to all of you. I just want to say one word about this last point that Jim made, which I think is useful about the silos of the divisions, may make it more difficult for this conversation to take place. At one level, I think that's right. And another, I think that this also reflects the way people work. I'm not sure that the divisions of NEH have predicted how people across the humanities are going to work, but it certainly would be good if there could be a little bit more cross-fertilization. And I just want to say one thing about that, which is that one place where this conversation can happen productively, and I'm just thinking of the sort of the public side of the humanities versus the more narrowly scholarly side of the humanities, is in the state councils. And Jim and I are both on the board of the National Humanities Alliance. For the first time in the history of the National Humanities Alliance, which is really principally composed of the scholarly societies, not only, and universities, and the Federation of State Humanities Councils, there's going to be a joint meeting of the National Humanities Alliance and the Federation of State Humanities Councils. And that, it seems to me, is a response to precisely this question of how we promote the conversation. Maybe it's not the political argument. I think Rick is right about that maybe we're looking for trouble if we try to make the political argument. But it's a conversation inside the humanities community that we haven't always had as well as we might. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. I have to say, it's something that people have been talking about and working on, at least so, as long as I've been around NEH, which goes back to longer than I'd like to remember. But the idea that the state councils and the NHA are actually going to meet together. By the way, it was a challenge to both organizations to figure out how we would do it and what the money would look like, and all the things that are required in a complicated negotiation, but it's going to happen. And I think that's a good sign. And I think also and I don't know a lot about, maybe some of you who are staffers at NEH can say, it is the 50th anniversary of NEH. That's what brings us into this room. And when I noodled around on the NEH website, I realized that this 50th anniversary is not going to go unnoticed at the agency itself. And I hope that that's an opportunity rather than the creation of a target, which in a way is something that we've worried about. So I think what I'm going to do is open it up to the floor if there are comments or questions. We'd love to hear them. Otherwise, I'm sure the four of us can keep talking. Anybody? Anything you'd like to add to this conversation? Yes, David.
David Berry,
Hi.
Community College Humanities Association. Just a couple anecdotes and kudos to the NEH. CCHA was founded with an emergency grant from the Endowment in 1979. At that time, the threat to community colleges was called vocationalism. Now, of course, it's workforce development. But community colleges would be turned into technical institutes. And so a counter force needed to be created to support the humanities and strengthen the humanities in the nation's community colleges. So CCHA has been doing that since 1979. I also have to talk about the peer review process because NEH noticed that community college proposals were not funded, and they figured out wisely that they needed to have a community college professor on the panel, and that might help inform the panel in a way in which they hadn't previously worked. The first panel I sat on, I sat across the table from a BDI kind of Cambridge, Boston fellow who looked at me and said, community college, that's where I get my car spot welded. That's how it started. But by the end, the panel had come to understand and appreciate how community college proposals can support and strengthen the humanities at those institutions. And so we have to commend the NEH for responding successfully to community colleges. At the same time, I have to say that much more needs to be done. I mean, we've only just started, I would say, but just a point of, I think, kudos again to the NEH.
Well, and I have to say, kudos to David Berry for having led CCHA so heroically for a very, very long time and forcing people in universities to pay more attention than they were when that beady-eyed fellow from Cambridge was sitting across the table from you. Other comments or questions? Malcolm.
Malcolm Richardson, I'm with the National Endowment for the Humanities, but I want to put aside my work life for a minute and just pretend to be a historian and note that one of the things that excellent discussion, by the way, thank you all. NEH has a number of partnerships with our counterparts, to the extent that counterparts in other countries. We have partnerships with the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada, the German Research Foundation. One thing that strikes me in all of this is that we alone in the United States seem to task our national funding agency with so many different missions. If you look at the functions or missions of these other agencies, they are purely research and scholarly associations for the most part. So I just throw that out as a background. I think in some future discussion, if we may need to ask why it is, comes back perhaps to your point, Rick, about the contours of American culture and how it shapes a particular funding strategy. But I think it's very different in the United States. And that's both at once our weakness, perhaps, in terms of funding, but also our strength, or possibly opportunity for our strength.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that if I could wave a wand but only in one direction, I would not want to increase the funding for the public programming, even though filmmakers would be the beneficiary, hypothetically, of such, but for scholarship. So I think that that's actually the more complicated area. That idea that that's where I think the rubber really meets the road in this cultural circumstance, where the idea that not all votes are equal, the meritocracy question, that sometimes, I mean, we know that when it comes to, say, microchip processors, we don't vote on who builds a microchip processor. We allow the guild of people whose judgment is best at deciding who's going to be given the funding to develop the new technology, to make yet a smaller microchip. Nobody votes on that. But when it comes to the humanities and history, philosophy, literary criticism, somehow the idea that it should be put up to some kind of referendum, metaphorically speaking, which is why, Gretchen, who I love you so dearly, my worry about your Mississippi model is that then the question is going to be, gee, if it's not an economic driver, if this isn't got an economic engine behind it, gee, it might not get, and I know that wasn't your point.
We live in the real world of
No,
the
we do live in
United States, and what people in this country will accept, and I think we have to make our arguments based on. I don't think we're going to change.
No.
I don't think the wand is going to work.
No, but what I'm saying is that I think that the problem is that we're not talking about things that the decision over which should have to do initially with whether or not it's an economic driver. And that, we can all, go watch The Imitation Game and Alan Turing. I mean, would we have had I know, it wasn't your point at all, but I'm saying that once you begin to float the idea that, well, it really can be rationalized on the basis of it being an economic driver, then what happens is that entire area which the endowment also funds, which isn't about public programming, but is about scholarship, and that's why the siloization is a good thing, in my view. Make sure that there is some stuff which is going to, quote, pure research, and keep it divorced. There has to be a cordon sanitaire between any idea of what public utility, precisely because you can make the argument, but only in retrospect, that there's a public utility to seemingly disengaged pure research. You can't make that going ahead, because if you try to make that in prospect, they go, what? Why do we want to save the three-toed barn owl? It has that kind of recondite quality of like any idiot knows. Nobody's going to be interested in that. That's such a tiny, no-constituency thing. And then you look backwards and you see how many of those tiny, no-constituency things actually evolved into powerful engines of economic opportunity, of commerce, of bettering the public weal. So that's really, my point.
There's a question in the back, and then there are a couple of people up front. No? I think there are a couple people on similar point when we take a few more questions from the floor and then the panel. Go ahead.
I'm Karen Middleman from NEH, and I've been there for 16 years, and I was Jerry Ensler's program officer when he first came to us with an idea to take a tiny museum in Dubuque and re-envision it. And I guess what I'm thinking about is you guys were drawing a distinction between public and pure research, and the importance of making the argument to the public about the value of pure research. But within public programs, most of what we fund is not Dubuque either. They're not huge economic powerhouses. They're 20 people coming together in a library on a cold night to watch a film and talk about it and figure out what it means. And where I think we've we, the entire humanities community, has fallen down is in making the case that those ideas that those 20 people are talking about, that ideas matter, that ideas transform lives. We all know that in this room. And that the ideas are the province of every American, as our founding legislation says. I think that's the ground that we ought to be resting on, not the economic grounds and not other grounds. And I think that's maybe the most powerful argument that hasn't been made.
Another point, yes.
Yeah. My name is Jo Blatty, and I'm a person who has worked in both as an historian and executive producer and museum administrator. In many of the areas that have been discussed so well by this panel. And I have struggled with the tensions that Rick Burns and Gretchen have discussed a lot this morning. And I just wanted to comment on the real tension which he has described so well, which as a fundraiser, I would say I've made exactly those arguments many times because I believe in those issues. There has to be that space. But I have, for instance, very creatively managed to leverage astonishing groups of funds like HUD money and an NEH challenge grant as parts of, in a peer review process to make the basis of a capital campaign in a museum that was based on, involving the entire museum community in, looking at the architectural program, the interpretive program for what we were doing, so that there was a real plan in which there was input from everybody. And when you do that building block process and, have a lot of political power in your community, which is when you get involved with institutions, there are issues that you simply have to deal with. And I think anybody who is working in an institutional context, has to accept that, as Gretchen was pointing out. And sometimes economics is part of that. Believe me, I never thought I would spend so much time at a moment in my life talking with HUD. But it was on the table, and it worked, damn it. It took years. And there's something to show for it. So out of the most unlikely alliances, something can be built, which involves both peer review and endowing an education position based on strong interpreter programs. So there's
But I think, in fairness, I think you'd have trouble making a case to HUD for funding the Thesaurus Lingua Graecae, which was a great scholarly project undertaken with support from NEH, and there are many things like that. I guess the distinction I would make is that if a project has economic consequences, that's a good thing. Nobody's going to argue we shouldn't have economic consequences. But there's a big difference between that and saying the single criteria that we ought to apply is whether or not a given project will have economic consequences. And many things that NEH does are for the long term. And they may actually, as Rick points out, there's a lot of scholarly work that was done on the history of New York before you made your film. And people would have said, well, who cares about, the population of 18th century New York and its demography? Who cares about that? People might have said that. But your film couldn't have been made without lots and lots of little pieces. And it's your point about building blocks. But the building blocks themselves sometimes are not as appealing as the entire structure. And sometimes we have to defend, and I think this is what Rick is saying, we have to defend the creation of the building blocks because we'll never build a building unless we have it.
But I just don't think we know how to talk about what we do
I agree.
in ways that other people can digest. Can I use that word? I think we talk like academics, and we talk about, I believe wholeheartedly in those 20 people sitting together in a library and watching a film and talking about ideas. And I believe in civic engagement. I feel like I've been cast as the Republican in the room when it's not.
You're the one who said you were going to
It's
side
not
with
true.
Karl Rove.
It's not true.
None of us would have drawn that conclusion.
But I think, having worked on these tough exhibitions for so many years, I've learned how to talk the language of other people, of other groups, the language they can hear. I'm not sure if I said the federal government should be funding 10 people sitting in a room and watching a film and talking about it because they're all going to talk about ideas. If I can hear what the politicians, if they can say, they would say, well, that's not, the federal government shouldn't be funding that. But if I say, well, in Dubuque, here's what.
Well, some politicians would say, what's the film about?
You are an employer, but you don't talk about yourself as an employer. You talk about yourself as an artist. You're an employer as well. I just think people in the humanities need to learn, academics in general, need to learn how to speak the language of politicians, the language of the people that have the money. What I tell my students is, my job is to help you learn how to talk to the people that have the money so you can assist rich people and rich organizations in doing good work. That's your job. You assist them in figuring out what to do with their money. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not I don't think that every program is gonna have the economic benefit that Jerry Ensler had, but I might use him as an example of this is what the humanities can do.
Yes.
It's often posing a question. It's recasting the question in language that other people find accessible.
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to commend the panel, first of all, for a wonderful discussion. My name is Pete Porter. I'm from New Jersey. I'm a high school history teacher, an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University, a member of the teaching division. And one of the most important roles that the NEH has provided that I've experienced is their grants to teachers. We're in a critical stage where professional development is challenged nonstop. And I just had a wonderful dinner with a friend of mine that I originally met at a Gilder Lehrman seminar 5 or 6 years ago, and then we did an NEH. And we were just basically swapping the stories of our experiences in NEHs and how we took them into the classroom and how they changed our lives. And just, I've seen so many colleagues who discover NEH because somebody says, hey, did you try NEH and do that? I know a colleague in New Jersey who went and did the March to Atlanta through NEH and brought it back to the classroom. One of the parents paid for a documentary film. She built the whole thing and then did a session at the AHA a couple of years ago on it. I mean, so the programming that the NEH has provided for teachers is so phenomenal. It gives them the opportunity to delve deeper into the content area that they love, which those opportunities are so limited. I've had arguments with my superintendent that you can provide me pedagogical training all you want. You can't afford to provide me the content training I need to be the expert to maneuver through the classroom and engage my students and ignite the fires that create the passion to get them to move into higher ed. So I would commend the NEH for what they do, and I would hope that as we talk about an environment in which money is getting constricted, that we're very careful with how we cut back on some of those opportunities that teachers have to go and experience things, whether it's in Honolulu, Hawaii, at the wonderful World War II memorial, or it's going off to Austria and Vienna and learning about Mozart and the different composers. So thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm Lee White, the Executive Director of the National Coalition for History, which is the advocacy arm of the historical community. I'm the one that has to do what you're saying, which is talk to the politicians and explain to them. The best way to get to them is to explain to them how it helps their constituents and how their constituents benefit from it. They don't care about the global, the humanities, or this. They want to know, how does this affect the people I represent? And just for curiosity, Senator Tom Harkin, who is one of the most powerful senators in the history of the Senate, who was the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, is retiring tomorrow. And I went to his website, and it has my legacy, and believe me, there's about 50 pages of his legacy. Now, let me just read you one of them. Dubuque, Since he joined the United States Senate in 1986, Harkin has secured more than $100 million in federal funding that has helped to shape the rebirth of Dubuque. His funding has helped open up new areas for development along the Mississippi River and renovated downtown. Together, these investments have brought new jobs and new residents and helped make Dubuque a jewel along the Mississippi. Tom Harkin realized, okay, I'll put that museum in Dubuque. People are going to come to Dubuque. That's the kind of arguments I know you are not. We're talking about market-driven, but this is market-driven.
But nobody knows that the NEH had a huge role in that.
Well, Tom is taking
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Joe Phelan. I also work at the NEH. I agree with what Peter talked about, the impact that the agency has had on teacher education, because I mean, they know what the agency does and they know what the humanities are because of what we have supported. But we've also had a long history of support, to speak to the man in the back, of civic education. And it was actually in the 80s that the American Historical Association and the Political Science Association, I'm a political scientist, joined together for the first and only time for the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. And we funded a lot of really great projects in that decade.
I think that's in some ways the point, which is that education is a public good, and education and democracy and citizenship have to be seen to have a value comparable to, if not equal to, economic development. And I don't think anybody up here on this panel is going to disagree with that. And maybe that's part of the problem is the extent to which we can somehow inject that kind of understanding into public culture. But there's this whole part of NEH which is contributing to the common good, as the new chairman has phrased it, that doesn't have anything to do directly with economic development, except to the extent that a nation that has intelligent, educated, active citizens is more likely to succeed economically.
And that, by the way, that really goes back to Malcolm's point about the difference between the United States and other countries. You know, the cultural traditions in Europe don't worry about democracy the way we do, or about civic education in the way that we do. And I think one of the reasons that we have these pure agencies that just support scholarship is because there's a completely different idea about the relationship between the state and culture, just to go back to something that Rick said. And it also touches on Jen's earlier point about democracy and meritocracy. We have that argument. We are in that conversation about the balance between democracy and meritocracy. And in the European academic world, it is a much, I won't say it's non-existent, but it's a much less common tension. And you know, it is both for us an opportunity and a challenge. And I guess just to go back to my question about failures, I think one of the things that we can point to as a big success that NEH is in many ways implicated in is the program of the American Historical Association this year. If you look at the program of the AHA this year, and you look at the program of the AHA in 1975, the presence of the public conversation about the humanities, about education in the humanities, about public programs, about museums, about film, on and on. The presence of that conversation on the program of the AHA compared to what it was 30 or 40 years ago, they're unrecognizable. And the learning societies, and I think, without flattering Jim too much, the learning societies have responded in the way they think about their role in a very, very different way than they did when the first political challenges to the humanities emerged in the 80s. And I don't think that's been cynical politics. I think it's actually been an expanded idea of not only what the agency could do, but what people in that larger humanities community could do. And in a funny way, you know, the four of us up here don't represent maybe we're not as representative of the historical community as some might be at the AHA, and that we've all probably moved in and out of the world of scholarship and the public humanities in a way that is quite different from what the tradition of the learned societies has been. The learned societies are coming along, but the AHA has been the leader and has been the leader in this for a long time, in part because of what Jim said earlier, that people actually feel that history should be accessible, and they don't feel that way, or they don't feel that way as much about literary criticism and philosophy. And it's a good thing they don't want literary criticism and philosophy to be more accessible, because that ain't happening.
Except, I think, and this is where I think the NEH can make a difference. And we're historians here, historical change. So once upon a time, when the NEH's re-grant program for fellowships, it's called the FAPIRI program, but it's where the NEH gives places like the Newberry Library, New York Historical Society, money to then give fellowships out to scholars. So once upon a time, the grants that we were given, I say we as I was at the Newberry, it was very clear. The division, our program officers said, do not burden fellows with public events. It's very admirable that the Newberry Library has these series of lectures and that you do these things with teachers, but do not burden fellows with that. The NEH is giving them their grants to do research, to write books, and we don't want you burdening them. And what began to happen, and this was generational change about maybe 20 years ago, maybe a little less, especially younger fellows came in and said, hey, wait a second, you've got these lectures, you've got these programs for teachers, why aren't you asking me to do it? They were offended. And we said, well, because the NEH tells us not to. And and then the NEH did loosen that, but there are no requirements. In public programs, the two people to my left are required, when they do grants for exhibits or for films, to have academics involved. The programs that fund fellowships, unlike the National Science Foundation, quite frankly, there is no requirement for any kind of public activity at all. Now, that would not be realistic for individual fellowships. Unlike the sciences where they're getting 6 or 7 figures, you can't take a little bit of your $48,000 research fellowship and go give a speech somewhere. But for other kinds of grants, whether it's in Division of Education or Research, is that possible? I don't know. But this is where I think maybe breaking down some of the silos might help create these kinds of, this kind of fostering of public and academic interaction.
Well, and we actually just created a program called the Public Scholar Program in the
Yes.
Division of Research, which in part I think speaks to what you're talking about. It was developed in part in collaboration with my division in public programs.
Yep. Thanks. Go ahead.
I'm Maxine Lurie. I'm the not really retired professor from Seton Hall. I'm also the chair, and Doug can laugh because he was at one point, of the New Jersey Historical Commission. And I have received worked on grants from the national NEH and also from the state. And I've taught workshops for teachers for the state NEH. But what really strikes me in listening to this conversation is how the issues that you're bringing up, I hear when the Historical Commission meets and we are in the process of evaluating our grant program. So the whole issue of like commercials say, do something and it'll bring a bigger audience to a history museum, and then you can turn around and say to the state legislators, there's an economic engine here that's important. I mean, I think this is also true on the state level. But the other thing that really struck me is we have had, and I've had more than one argument within the commission because it gives project grants and it gives operating grants to keep historic sites open. And I constantly argue for the project grants for scholarship because otherwise the museums and the historic sites cannot offer anything new. And without being able to offer anything new, in the long run, they are not going to be able to attract audiences over and over again. So I think I think that funding for the scholarship is crucial, and we have to argue for it. The members of the commission are some of them have their doubts about scholarship, so I really feel like I'm defending scholarship and my great successes and convincing several people that this actually really is important. But what I'm really saying is I think you need to learn, historians, the Council for the Humanities needs to learn how to make the argument about why this is important.
Yes.
If you think about the democratization in the next 50 years of the NEH, it seems one thing that they do over in Europe that we have not yet done is have national, even international initiatives to put art, history, culture online. Europeana is doing this in a gigantic way. GIST, which is an NEH partner, in some cases is doing this. And I wonder if there isn't some benefit to contemplating what that online future for all of this work might include. The great films that have been made with NEH support, many of them cannot be seen today. The great publications that have been put out with NEH support, it could be so different if funding were available for future work to be out there for the public.
Because that's a legal problem, not just a cultural one.
It's a funding problem.
The copyright problem. But the agency has done a lot to support the digital humanities and lots of great projects to put up digital materials. Jim was the editor of the Chicago Encyclopedia, which originated, when we were first thinking about it, we thought it was a book. And while we were thinking about it, it became something else. But it still lives online, it still grows, and that's true of lots of projects that NEH supports. The question of what to do about those things that have already been supported, which live under copyright and all of those rules, that's an interesting and complicated problem. But I think the endowment has done actually a great job. A little bit late to the game, but in it nonetheless, in supporting the digital humanities and supporting big projects to help put things online. Unfortunately, it's an infinite amount of money that's required to put it all online. We haven't said very much about the budget of NEH, and I just wanted to, as a sobering point, maybe for us to end on, I looked to see what the budget number for this year is. It represents a 70% decrease in real dollars over what the budget was in 1982, under. 70% decrease in real dollars. So we're doing a lot with what turns out to be a lot less money, or the agency, I'm saying we're doing a lot. The agency is doing a lot with what turns out to be a lot less money than used to be available. And maybe that turns us back to thinking about how we make the case. But it's 11 o'clock, and I want to thank the three members of the panel, and Mary Beth, who actually wrote something that informed the conversation, and pay tribute again to Clem Price, who was really a hero of the very conversation that we're having, and thank all of you